Welcome back to the OFFbit, friends. Last week we upgraded our Q8400 to the E5430 Xeon. But we ran out of time. We never got to test our games. This week we're going to see just how well an E5430 can do, with some 2020 titles and some old favourites. Now to recap on last episode's Xeon E5430 versus the Q8400, both CPUs are clocked at the same speed at 2.67 GHz. L2 cache differs, with the Xeon having 12 mega cache, with each die in the CPU having 2 lots of 6 meg. Now the Q8400 only have 4 meg in total, and it's a 2x2 setup. Both have a 1333 MHz front side bus. TDP on the Xeon was 15 watts lighter than the Q8400, coming in at 80 watts. Meanwhile, the Q8400 runs 95 watts. The Xeon is a socket LGA 771, whilst the Q8400 is an LGA 775. So getting the Xeon to work on a 775 board required some modifications, which we covered in the last video. Now, in the last video, we found that the E5430 Xeon was 5 to 10% better in performance in the synthetic benchmarks. Now, we're going to run some GPU synthetic benchmarks, and then we're going to play some games. So, Cinebench R15, we scored 49 frames per second with the GTX 750 paired with our Xeon E5430. Sitting us in 4th position behind the HD 5850s, HD 5770 and GTX 570s. Now I have a suspicion that this test is a little bit better for your Radeon cards, just with those scores. In Unigene Heaven, we scored 632 points. Out front of everything, the only other card we have there is the same card, the GTX 750 with the Q6600. So there's a big difference from the Q6600 and the E5430 with this GTX 750. The GTX 750 pretty much left everything else for dead. Moving into 3D Mark's Fire Strike, the GTX 750 with the E5430 scored us 3,391 points. I love 3D Mark Fire Strike. It really puts the cards where they live. Just have a look at the GTX 750 with the E5430 versus the Q6600 with the GTX 750. They scored in the same ballpark. So we came second place to the GTX 570 on the Q8400 at 3 GHz. Just shows you that the 570 is a bit of a higher tier card in its series. Anyway, let's move on to the fun stuff. Let's get on the games. Kicking off our first benchmarks of gameplay with PUBG. We're running at 1920 by 1080 at low settings. This game actually played quite smooth. It was actually not too bad. Though, every now and then you get a load up when you didn't need it. So sometimes you'd be in a battle or you'd be running around and you just get a lag. I think that might help with an overclock. We'll look into that. But anyway, let's look at our frame rates. So average frame rates for PUBG was 52.1 frames per second. Minimums fell to 14.7 frames. Our max frames was at 97.6 frames per second. 1% lows at 15.1, and our 0.1% lows hit 8 frames per second. So basically reflected, not too bad for gameplay. I mean, if we want a few more frames and probably a bit smoother, we could drop back to a 720p resolution and maybe drop the resolution quality, 3D rendering quality anyway. Overall, I was actually quite happy with how the E5430 handled the GTX 750 in this game. Next up, we are jumping into Sea of Thieves. Sea of Thieves ran pretty good on this machine. Now, we did set the settings down to low, or better known in the world of Sea of Thieves as Cursed. Resolution we're running was 1920 by 1080. Average frame rate we picked up for Sea of Thieves is 64.1 frames per second. So for the most of this game, it ran perfectly fine. Now we did hit minimums at 0.4, which is the same as our 0.1% lows. So we did get a couple of big stutters on loading of assets. Our max frames we hit was 104.3 frames per second. So there's quite a vast range of performance stats there. So CPU seemed to be pretty bottlenecking to the GPU in this game. So it did run pretty good, but the CPU was working pretty hard the whole time. So I think when we get to overclock the Xeon E5430, we'll try and get to 3 GHz or 3.1 like we did with the Q8400. And I reckon this game will play a lot better. But anyway, let's move on to the next one. Minecraft Windows 10, or better known as Minecraft Bedrock Edition. In this game at 1920 by 1080 at medium settings. Actually, no, default settings. This game ran perfectly smooth. Now, there is a frame limit on this game of 60 frames per second. So, anyway, the average frame rate for this game, Minecraft Bedrock Edition, was 58.3 frames per second. So this game ran pretty much perfectly smooth the whole time. Minimum frame rate was 46 frames per second. Maximum frame rate was 60.8 frames per second. The 0.1% lows was at 26.4 frames per second. Now, if you're looking to get into Minecraft and you want to play the Bedrock Edition, there's every good reason to get into this game. It is a fantastic game to play. Just create whatever you want. It's great playing it in survival mode. Get a few mates, start your own server. It is brilliant. Now, anyway, any Core 2 quad, I reckon, could run this game with a nice frame rate. You just got to pair it with a half decent video card. So it's needless to say that the E5430 plays this game no problem. Moving on into Fortnite. Now, the CPU in Fortnite seemed to be just working 100% on all cores at all the time. We ran this game at low settings at the 1920 by 1080 resolution. Now, for most of the gameplay, it played fairly smooth, but there were some shocking loads with the assets and just a couple things that happened. And the numbers show that. So our average frame rate was 70.3 frames per second. So most of the time, it ran pretty good. Our minimum frame rates fell to 6.8 frames per second, which is part of that loading. Now, our max frame rate hit 110.1. So just a very large variety of frame rates there. 1% lows was 2.9 frames per second. 0.1% lows was 1.6 frames per second. So at times, you would get a lot of stutter. And I'd say that's from the bottlenecking on the CPU. So we might better get some of those frames up by pulling back some of the details in the graphics. But I'm looking forward to see what the overclock does with this. Jumping into Blizzard's Overwatch. So this game ran pretty good. It was fairly playable. However, I always felt that it was just holding me back a little bit. So I think just a bit of a smoother frame rate in this would probably be a lot better. Or better average overall with the minimums coming up. Anyway, in saying that, let's have a look at the frame rates. Then running this game in low at 1920 by 1080, our average frames per second was 54.7. And frame rate fell to 18.3 frames per second. Our max frame rate was 79.7 frames per second. 1% lows was 4.2, and our 0.1% lows was 3.2 frames per second. So maybe dropping the resolution or pulling back the graphics would probably pull those 1% or 0.1% lows up. But I think when we get to overclocking it, we'll see improvements in this game. Last game we're looking at today is Genshin Impact. We ran this game on medium with the resolution of 1920 by 1080. Now this game, I've said it in another video, it is just absolutely beautiful. The setting, the visual, the graphics, just the audio, the ambience, it just puts you in a very chilled, cool and calm place. Now, if you have the GTX 750 with the E5430 and you're playing this game, I think you'd be pretty happy with its result. Average frame rates for Genshin Impact was 57.3 frames per second. Minimum frame rates fell to 37 frames per second. Maximum frame rates hit 60.2 frames per second. Our 1% lows was at 29.9 frames per second, and our 0.1% lows hit 6.1 frames per second. So yes, it did some loading, but because of the nature of the game, it probably would not feel too bad. And in my opinion, it felt perfectly fine. So, wrapping this up, the Xeon E5430. Yes, it is better than the Q8400. That extra cache does make a fair difference. However, being clocked at 2.67 gigahertz, I think is holding the E5430 back just as much as the Q8400 gets held back. So, what are our plans for this motherboard and setup? Well, the E5430, we're going to overclock it in another video and try and hit 3.1 gigahertz with it. We'll also add in a better video card. We're looking at probably a GTX 770 at the moment. So pairing that with an overclock should give us a pretty decent outcome. So I'm looking forward to see how much we can push out of a Core 2 quad system with a good video card and an overclock. Overall, the E5430 performed a lot better than I thought it would, especially in games like PUBG. I know Fortnite struggled, but the Q8400 struggled a lot at its stock clock. Now we are running 6 gig RAM because I know we've run out of RAM a few times, so that's definitely helped this system. Anyway, that's all we got today for the OFFbit. Now, if you've liked this video, please hit that like button. If you want to see more of this content, please subscribe. It really encourages me to keep on making these videos, and it just grows this nice little community that we've got going on this channel. Now, guys, please use the comments. I love reading. I love to hear what you guys are thinking, and love to respond and just help you out if I can, or just give me some ideas for some other videos. Look, I've really enjoyed some of the comments that you guys have put forth to me. Anyway, that's it for us today. We'll catch you next time on the OFFbit.